So, a bit of an update here on the Tamiya Dynastorm build, or project rather. The most obvious thing you can see here is that I replaced the shocks, so I'll start with that. I tried to use the stock Dynastorm shocks on this chassis, and I had some leaking problems. In the past video, I had theorized that the leaking was coming from the bottom seal cover here, but it turns out that's not the case. I did replace the O-rings. There's two O-rings down here, and this does, despite the fact that there's no O-ring here between the bottom cap and the bottom of the shock body, it's just like a plastic spacer, this does actually seal pretty nicely. The leaking was coming from the top, between the shock cap and the O-ring here. I did replace these O-rings with a different size. Initially, I had used a 12mm by 1.5mm O-ring, and that was actually too big, so I went to a 10 by 1.5 O-ring, which is actually, at least in terms of diameter, is the correct size. But maybe the 1.5mm thickness is not quite enough. But even if I went to a thicker O-ring, I'm not sure that that would have solved the problem, because what I was finding was that with the shocks mounted this way, completely vertical, on the shock towers, oil was coming out here. And when I eventually took the shocks off, I opened them up, some of those shocks had an oil level that was actually pretty deep down. So quite a lot of oil leaked out. And even though the oil level was down here, below the top of the shock, there was still oil coming out. So what I think was happening is, it may be fundamental to the way this particular type of shock is designed. There's this plastic sleeve here that's part of the Dynastorm shock arrangement, and the shock piston rides up against this sleeve on the inside. So when you fill the shock oil, it fills in here. Now there is going to be a finite amount of space between the outer surface of this sleeve and the inner surface of the shock body. That's how this can slide in and out. And as you can see, maybe the camera picks this up a little bit. You see that glaze there? There is a little bit of oil there that finds its way in between the sleeve and the shock body. So what was probably happening was that the weight of the oil on the inside here, where it's supposed to go, is pressing down on itself, and then that oil makes it to the bottom of the sleeve and then pushes back up through the tiny amount of space at the interface between the sleeve and the shock body, and then it gets pushed out up here at the sort of junction between where the top of the sleeve meets the top of the shock body. So even if you have an oil level that's down here, that can still generate enough pressure apparently to push oil back up around the sleeve and then out of the top of the shock. And maybe a thicker O-ring here will help to seal that off, but it seems like a fundamental problem with these. I would have to check, like I have another Dynastorm, I'd have to try to fill those shocks up and check to see if that's actually true. But that's just my theory right now. So I decided to go with a set of shocks that don't have that problem. These are the Tamiya aeration oil-filled buggy shocks. These particular ones I think are made for the DF03. I had used these on my Top Force for some years. That car was actually sitting on a shelf for a while, so I only actually used these shocks a couple of times, and then I just put it on a shelf. So these shocks are effectively brand new, and they're more like conventional shocks where there's no sleeve, if you will, on the inside of the shock body. And I get more tuning options for these, because for the Dynastorm shocks, they come with one set of springs, front and rear. You might be able to find like option spring sets for these, like aftermarket, or not aftermarket, but Tamiya option set springs for these. But they're very rare and probably super expensive. And you could probably fit big bore springs on it and make that work. But for this particular shock type, I have like a hard, medium, and soft set of springs, front and rear. Plus the shock bodies themselves are threaded, so the shock collars I get more easier adjustment with compared to these, which you have to use clips or spacers. So I figured these would be better to use. The only thing I had to do was to drill extra holes in the front shock tower. The rear shocks are long enough that they're approximately the same length as the stock rear shocks for the Dynastorm, but for the actually these are the rear shocks, but for the front shocks, these shocks are shorter, so I just needed to drill extra holes. And so I did one hole on the outside and one hole on the inside of the tower here. As you can see on the front tower, the top of the tower is a bit wider, so you can fit 3 holes. Where I had to drill holes, because these shocks are a bit shorter, is on this part here where it narrows up. So I could probably fit 3 holes here, but they'd be pretty close together, and I don't want to risk breaking the tower. So I just put in 2 holes, and chances are I'll need the outer holes anyway to effectively stiffen up the front suspension if I'm going to run this on turf. So just use the outer hole. Right now I have stiff springs front and rear, so we'll see how that goes. But other than that, the car is kind of done. You know, the steering servo's in there, speed control, the motor. I'm going to start, I plan to start off by putting a silver can motor in this. This is a Tamiya torque tuned motor. You know, I have a fan here, a Novak Cyclone speed control on this side. This is all kind of ported over from what I had in my Traxxas Rad 2 most recently, but I'm not going to run that car anymore, so I just took the electronics out of there, tossed them in here. I have this LiPo cutoff switch here. I've gone over this in prior videos with running older DC speed controls without LiPo cutoff and how to actually get LiPo cutoff in them. Basically, this has a receiver plug on it that has 3 ports, power, ground, and signal, but there's no signal input, so you just take the signal line from the receiver plug on your speed control and you plug it into the receiver plug on the LiPo cutoff. And then you just don't use the receiver plug for the speed control, you use the LiPo cutoff receiver plug and you just plug that into your receiver in the speed control port, and then there you go. You turn this on, that sets your LiPo cutoff, and then you turn this on and that turns your speed control on. It also allows you to bypass the BEC, so you end up getting a higher voltage to your servo. It makes it run faster. So, that's kind of it. I mean, the only thing left is to, you know, mount a receiver, mount the wheels, do the body, the wing. That's all like little stuff. You know, the main part of this is done. The only other thing to do would be to build the spare gearbox here with a more modern ball differential as a backup gearbox in case I strip the splines on these diff out drives. But other than that, I'd say this project is largely complete, except for some, you know, again, aesthetic things. So overall thoughts about this buggy, now that I've, you know, effectively built a Tamiya Dynastorm, I would say it's a slightly more interesting than an RC10 B2. You go back and watch my B2 video, I talked about how that was very uninspiring, but only by a little bit. And I say that because in building this, what I have here isn't really a Dynastorm. It's a Dynastorm base with modified parts. I have super astute arms because that gives me, allows me to put the shocks more to the outside, which you would want for higher grip. I have all these aluminum, you know, parts here, like the front bulkhead and the inner arm mounts and so forth, because the original Tamiya plastic parts are crap. You know, I had to heavily modify parts of the rear gearbox, including, you know, the slipper arrangement. I have a different slipper arrangement, so I can run like modern spur gears. So, you know, there's bits of like Kyosho parts on this. There's bits of, you know, other stuff on here. The shocks, again, they're not stock shocks. So by the end of it, when you build it out to something that is, you know, let's say a more reasonable build, you're not left with much in terms of having something that's faithful to the original Dynastorm. It's Dynastorm-like. It looks like a Dynastorm. Okay, fine. So in that sense, you know, it might be interesting to run. It might actually be pretty good on AstroTurf, especially with all this extra weight from the aluminum front bulkhead. So, you know, I might be pleasantly surprised with enough setup time on it. But, you know, it doesn't really wow me the way that some other buggies did. Like, I was always really interested in the Kyosho Pro X. That's a buggy that wows me. And the Rampage Pro E, that's a buggy that wows me. This one is okay. You know, if you really want to get one, I don't know. It's probably not really worth spending the money on it, given what these things go for. But anyway, those are just my thoughts. So that's it for now, and thanks for watching.